Welcome back to the Corner of Story and Game, where we dive into the intersection of storytelling and game design. I'm your host, Gerald Ford, and today we have a fascinating guest joining us, Jason Kingsley, co-founder of Rebellion Developments and an industry veteran known for his contributions to game design and storytelling. Jason has a deep passion for history, which greatly influences his work in video game narratives. Today, we're going to be discussing the intersection of history and game design and how historical events and figures can inspire the narratives we see in games and fiction. So, let's dive into it. Jason, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. It's delightful. It's very cold. We were just talking earlier about how cold it is here. It's not cold by standards of really cold places on the planet.
Well, it's warmed up here finally today. It's only minus 10, but yeah, I know the cold.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid we're minus 2 in the degrees centigrade here in the UK, which means it's frozen, which means the horse troughs will have the ice broken, which means that when you walk, the mud is now frozen and is a bit lumpy. So you have to be careful you don't twist an ankle, and you're carrying hay bales and things like that. So very reminiscent, and it's quite a leveler. It takes you back down to what it must have been like quite recently for most of humanity in the winter. This is what they would have experienced, whereas we now, with central heating and cars and paved streets, we don't experience it in the same way. But the vast majority of human history has had frozen landscapes for some of the time anyway.
Yeah, growing up, I know exactly what you're talking about. But you mentioned history, and that's what we're here to talk about today is pulling from history to inform narratives in digital games and fiction. So that's the topic I want to get us into. But before we get there, I do like to set the stage, kind of lay a foundation with an origin story. How did you fall in love with the written word, with games? How did you find your way into the industry? Kind of the story of your journey as it happened.
Well, I was a very precocious reader at school. I remember when I first went to school, they showed me the books and I said, "Have you got any bigger books than that to read?" And the teacher went, "Okay." And they gave me the books from the year above. And I went, no, those are still too rubbish. So I had to go 3 years ahead, according to my mother. I don't remember this, so I'm being told this. I had to go 3 years ahead of my reading age because I wanted to look at adventure stories. And I liked books with pictures, but not too many pictures. And in my reading, I was always interested in escapist fantasy from a very earliest years. King Arthur, obviously not the original King Arthur stories, but the sort of modified stories for children, because the original King Arthur stories are quite dark and have a lot of adult content in them. But they're interested in the quest and the sort of narrative in general. And then I had a bit of a problem at school, which was I loved my English and I loved my creative writing, but I also loved science as well. And under the English system, you had to sort of choose. You had to choose arts or sciences at quite an early age, sort of more or less at about 12 years old. You sort of, if you wanted to do science, you did biology, chemistry, physics, maybe maths, and you had to drop art, English, music. You funneled into one of two. And I went through this sort of process of thinking, well, look, I can study story and narrative on my own, which I've been doing anyway. I can't really study physics and maths and science in the same way. I kind of need a bit more formal training, and you've got to read the textbooks and everything. So I chose the science part, but I managed to keep going with my love of storytelling as a background task throughout it. And then I went to university, did a zoology degree at Oxford University, did a master's there, and then started Rebellion with my brother. So computer games started to come in. And I wrote a book called Steel Eye and the Lost Magic for Ladybird, which is a now defunct book publisher. But they published hardback books, very small ones that were sort of informational and interesting. And this was a competition book where you had to, like a choose your own adventure. This is roughly the same time as the choose your own adventures were kind of coming to prominence. And that was very successful. It was a worldwide, not worldwide, it was a British number one. And they paid me £800, which when I was 16 was a lot of money. It was more. It was like, wow, this is great. Full buyout. And I've got the rights back, actually, because they were bust. And I managed to actually literally buy the rights back for the book. And so I was interested, but that was that was a game book, but you could flick through it and choose the paragraphs you went to. So you'd sort of unravel the story. And I felt that that could be done with a computer. And my brother was really into the technology and the computers. And I thought, wow, we could computerize this. So I started to look into computers. We're talking about the very earliest, not the very earliest computers, but pretty early, like Commodore PETs and Commodore 64s and 8-bit computers. And we never did computerize that, but we started our journey in making computer games. And I've retained my brother and I both. We're the co-owners, co-founders of Rebellion. We've got nearly 600 full-time members of staff now in the UK. Quite a big turnover. We make big games like Sniper Elite, Zombie Army. We've got a new game out called Atomfall, which is coming out next year. There's another Sniper Elite game coming out. So we have a huge catalog and growing catalog of things going on. We also publish comic books. We publish novels, other people's novels. And in my case, we're publishing one of my novels called The Lord of Blackthorn, which hopefully we'll talk about a little bit later. Great. But we focus very much on storytelling in different media, because you can tell a story in a linear way, like a novel. You can also tell a story in a kind of branching way, like an interactive game book. You can also tell a story in a computer game, which isn't branching. It is more, here's the landscape. Now you make your story by your actions as you go through the adventure. And for me, they all have their own challenges and structures. And it's really interesting to have grown and, matured in that world with telling stories in lots of different ways. That's where I am now. And I've now got my first novel underway. So
Wow. So really, this podcast could have been about branching narratives versus emergent narrative, and it could have been about transmedia storytelling.
it literally could have been. Yes. And one of the things I'm often telling the team, because I've got teams of people that I'm still the creative director and CEO of the company. I've kept that term creative director in there because it's important to me, because I don't want to be just CEO. Yeah, whilst I'm one of the bosses with my brother, I see that as almost as an obligation, not a right. And the thing I choose to do is to tell stories in interesting ways and focus very much on what matters to the player, what matters to the reader. So sometimes when you're designing a computer game, you have this view, like being an author, you have this view of the landscape that the reader or the player doesn't have. And if your story only works because you have this sort of helicopter view of the landscape, then you're not telling the story. You've got to tell the story from ground level, including with a computer game, including with a novel. You've got to imagine what these people can see and what they can't see as well. And you've got to explain that to them somehow. So anyway, yeah, so we could probably talk for a long time on the theory of story design.
I'm thinking that I'm gonna have to have you back again in the new year to do another one on that, because I love talking about that stuff too. But I need to talk to you about pulling history, because you are a historian. Like, you are recognized as somebody who studies history and incorporates it into what you're working on. So that's the focus
absolutely.
today.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I've fallen into being a YouTuber. So I have my own YouTube channel called Modern History TV. It's a weird choice of name, I agree, but it wasn't meant to be a success. And then it became a success. And then I didn't get around to changing the title. And now it's kind of stuck. And I was like, I should have paid more attention up front, but never mind. So there we are. So in particular, I'm fascinated by the medieval period, because it's such a transitional period between kind of imperial Rome, and then you go through what I think poetically works called the Dark Ages, although one is not supposed to call it the Dark Ages anymore. But I still think that kind of works as reference to the sort of Empire of Rome and then no Empire of Rome, and what happened to the island I'm living in, Britain in particular, and knights and armor and horses and the chivalric code that never really was, or was sort of only a vague notion that some people had. I studied the chivalric code, and the more I studied it, the more I didn't understand what was going on. It moved away entirely. And some of the earliest rules for knights were: don't rob from the church and don't fight on Sundays, which is kind of quite basic rules for violent men,
Yeah.
to adopt. Fairly easy to not rob churches. Obviously, the church set these rules up. Don't rob churches or holy ground, and don't fight on Sundays because you should be praying. That was the very beginnings of the chivalric code, and then it expanded into the thing we understand it vaguely about today. But I'm also particularly interested in ordinary people. Kings and nobles are great. They get written about and, wonderful. Talk about king this and emperor this and whatever it might be. But I'm fascinated in particular by what it meant to be who most of us were, which was ordinary people that didn't get written about in names. Although in some cases they do get written about. Because one of the areas I'm very keen on primary evidence. So I'm keen on actual archaeology and written documents from the time period. And we have some wonderful original documents. Some of them are obviously written by people at the time with a nod to the future, like the Venerable Bede in the Dark Ages is sort of writing a history of Britain, which is filled with real stuff and not real stuff, and then very clearly not real stuff. So, for example, he talks about Britain was founded by the castaways of Troy. And you're thinking, what? And then Brutus gets involved. It's all very weird and surreal. It's like fan fiction for history. But then you go up to 11th, 12th century, you start to get court records. We start to have the notes taken by scribes in court cases. And these are always, these are very prosaic. And they illustrate what mattered enough to people for people to go to court. And these are very primitive forms of court. But nonetheless, they decided they had enough of a peeve with their neighbor to take them to court. And that would have taken years and probably cost an equivalent amount of money as it does today. But it's things like this person's name, Patrick, whoever, his pig escaped and ate my turnips. And you think, that's funny, but it's also, in an agrarian society, very serious, because if your turnips get eaten, that's a big chunk of your food, because there weren't supermarkets and other people, if they had a bad harvest and you had a terrible harvest because your neighbor's pig ate your turnips, you are going to potentially starve. And if not starve to death, you're going to be very hungry because maybe you don't have the money to buy turnips from anybody else. Maybe there isn't a surplus. And there's a huge amount of cesspits overflowing, for example, and people's boundary walls not being maintained. And these are the sort of thing that neighbors fall out about today. You put the fence in the wrong place, and then a massive fight ensues between two neighbors who live next door to each other but now hate each other. We've all probably either heard about it or experienced it ourselves. Somebody's making too much noise. They had that as well. After curfew, so-and-so is playing the bagpipes excessively. And he was fined 2 shillings and 6pence and told not to play the bagpipes after sunset. And you go, what a brilliant story. So there was one person madly playing the bagpipes in this village for months, and driving people crazy. Just, that kind of stuff. It's fascinating, but very, very human stories. So I talk about a lot of my videos about that. How did poor people travel? It's all right talking about rich people. They had money to spend. But if you wanted to travel on pilgrimage and you didn't have any money, where do you stay? How do you survive? And the answer is monasteries. These religious institutions had a duty of care to poor people in need. And so you went from monastery to monastery, having very modest food, but being looked after by the church. And I think, again, that's a wonderful background for a story as well.
So how much of this interesting historical minutia influences narratives you've worked on? How does that influence your storytelling?
Hugely, but in the background. So for example, I do joust. I fight real fighting in tournaments, and I've really jousted with solid lances in exactly the same way that knights of old on my horses with real steel armor in a competition at the Tower of London. Exactly the same place that Henry VIII did joust. I've done it at Pendennis Castle, Dover Castle, Kenilworth Castle. These are all real places where real knights in the medieval period jousted, and I've jousted there for organisations like English Heritage or the Historic Royal Palaces, which are all charitable institutions in the UK that look after old buildings. And these some of these buildings are very, very old. I mean, they go back pre-Roman. Dover Castle has got a Roman lighthouse on one end, and then a medieval castle, and then World War II bunkers. And this is just the place is so steeped in history, including up to the modern day. So I've done that. So when I'm talking about real weapons in my games or real armor, I know from personal experience what it's like to wear plate armor. I know what it's like in the cold. I know what it's like in the heat. I know what it's like to have a fly into your helmet just before you're about to take a pass down the lists, and how distracting it is to have a fly going ding, 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 ding inside your visor. And then you suddenly realize, what if it's a wasp? and I can't open my visor because I've got a hand on the reins and I've got a lance in this hand, and he's just signaled. So I have to go, and I have to ignore the fact that I've got a fly in my visor. And you think, yeah, I wonder if Henry VIII felt this. I've sweated in armor so much that I can't get my helmet off at all because it's stuck on my head, because the linen lining, because it's made of natural materials, the linen lining has got so soaked in sweat that it's swollen slightly and stuck on my head. And then I have to have the ground crew very carefully sort of wiggle the helmet up off my face and when a helmet is halfway off, it's the worst feeling ever, because you can't see, you can't hear, really uncomfortable, but you can't do anything about it. You're relying entirely on your ground crew and your horse to stay still. And you think, oh my goodness, if the horse panics, I can't see what I'm doing or where I'm going. How's this going to end? I've had a saddle break underneath me, pushed down into a horse's spine. The horse was fine. It's a horse called Warlord, is still with me, and he's a brilliant old boy, but he panicked because he had this nasty feeling on his back, and I had to throw myself off the saddle at a full gallop in plate armor to get my weight off his back. And then as soon as the weight was off his back, the saddle was fine, and he slowed down and he was fine. But I had to make a decision. It's like, where do I try and fling myself off the saddle? Because it all looks very hard down there. It's all 6-7 foot down on the ground when I'm traveling at 30 miles an hour. This is going to hurt, but I've got to do it, So those facts kind of go into the background. So I also know about researching history. So the Sniper Elite series of games that we do is all about the sort of war behind the war. So it's all about spying and assassinations behind enemy lines. And to a certain extent, we play on the idea of the super weapons against each other. In the case of Sniper Elite, the Nazi super weapons, the Wunderwaffe, as they called them, the V2, the V1, all the other special weapons they had. The Allied side had their own super weapons as well. And so there we try to lean on history in a plausible way. So I think of it sometimes when people are saying, oh, is that accurate? It's like, well, it's plausible. We won't ever know what actually happened because nobody wrote it down, but it's plausible. And I sometimes think our historical research is a bit like that. There's obviously some things that are impossible. If somebody was born 100 years after somebody else, they could have never met. But things could have happened that weren't recorded because so little history that was actually written down that survives today, which is incredibly frustrating, but also gives us a bit of scope. So that's how I look at it. I look at things like historical plausibility in my writing.
Would you say having like those experiences, is it more important to have to have the emotion authentic, the feelings of what it would be like, the sense of what that world might feel like, as opposed to exact minutia?
I think, personally, I think so. I think the human emotional side of an experience connects us more to the past. Saying, if I say that the plate armor I wear is quite heavy and is hot in the summer, that's factually true. But if I was to say that the joust was delayed by half an hour, but I already had my armor on. But for reasons outside my control, I had to wear it for half an hour longer. I'm now quite tired. I'm now much sweatier than I'm expecting. I'm desperately thirsty, and I can't find my squire. My squire's gone off to do something else, and I desperately need a drink. How do you get a drink into your helmet when the helmet's fastened to you? Can you take it off? Some helmets you can, some you can't. Some of the ones designed for jousting are very specifically designed not to come off very easily, to protect you from the lance, which is going to kill you if it hits you in the wrong way. So, good on you for wearing armor that stops you dying. That's the principle. And then sometimes I look at criticisms of fiction. When I look at, even in a fantasy environment, let's say Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, if the armor doesn't protect people from the threats they're going to face, for me, I'm instantly taken out of the story, because you only wear armor if it's going to protect you, because it's heavy, it's expensive, and it does slow you down and it tires you out. So if it doesn't actually add to your survivability on the battlefield, why on earth are you wearing it? It's not costume. It's a real thing. So when I look at a jousting show, for example, or a jousting sequence in a movie, and there's a big gap, there's a big gap all around the neck, for example. The gorget doesn't fit, or the wrapper doesn't fit properly because it's costume armor. It slightly freaks me out because I know that I wouldn't be able to take a joust. I wouldn't take a shot at that person because their armor's broken. There are ways you can signal to your opponent. You put your arm. What we used to do is you put your lance out sideways and you signal to everybody you've seen something and maybe other people haven't seen on their armor. So you're not going to take a hit. You're not going to try and hit them because it's dangerous, And if there's a piece of armor not attached or their visor's not down, I've had people charge at me without the visor down. They've forgotten. They're so nervous, they've forgotten to lower their visor, and you're thinking, you lunatic, you're coming at me. And it's like, no, don't take a shot. Things like that. The armor protects you. You cannot, unless you have a magic sword, I suppose, you're not going to cut through plate armor. Steel is good at its job. You can maybe stab through it if you're super strong, and I guess if you're talking about really super strong or unnaturally strong characters in certain circumstances, that's fine. But when you see the hero without a helmet, because heroes rarely wear helmets in movies, because you want to spend the money on your actor and you want to see their face, I guess. You rarely see them with a helmet, and you're thinking, yeah, the slightest tap on that head with an accidental smack on that head with even the piece of wood is going to put you out of the combat. And they're slicing across the belly armor of heavily armored orcs coming towards them, and you're thinking, that orc armor looks pretty much bulletproof. You're not going to cut through it, even with glamdring, even with a massive, unless there's a magic sword involved, and maybe magic kind of trumps the physics of it. So I'm always keen on seeing, even if you've got dragons, the armor still needs to protect you from the ordinary threats.
Right. That's the depth that your mind goes on that's incredible. Bringing historical relevance to fiction, whether it's fantasy or not, and to games, does that offer the opportunity to explore viewpoints or perspectives that other genres may not? Like, is there an advantage there just in the format?
Well, I think it's quite interesting looking through history, trying to imagine yourself into the role of characters from that age, because it's a bit like doing a role-playing game. If you're genuinely trying to role-play, you sometimes have to forget what you know as a player. I'm a huge believer in role-playing for fun and not necessarily metagaming, not necessarily playing the game to get the best score. You can do that. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not how I play it. I play it to pretend to be somebody else. So if I'm playing, I don't know, a heroic character who is desperate to show his worth on the battlefield, and the DM says to me, there's a giant thing coming down the corridor, you don't stand a chance. It's just like, I don't care. My character thinks that here's my chance to prove myself. And all the other players go, no, he's got more hit points than you, and he's got all this stuff. And it's like, no. My character wants this moment, and I know he's probably going to die, but that's the point. That's the narrative point. His motivation is to prove himself against unsurmountable odds, and mostly in real life, you go in against them insurmountable odds and you're done for, aren't you? You know, most of us aren't heroes. But in a narrative environment where you've got a good DM and other players, everybody leans into that, and then they can make it into a heroic moment. And maybe the barbarian who isn't quite as brave as me, the knight, the paladin or whatever. I often play paladins. What a surprise! But you know, maybe he trips me up on the way there and drags me, binds me and drags me away because he knows I won't. That my character won't not fight this character. This monster that's coming, and he wants to get me away. And so now I've got an annoyance. My character's been his future has been stolen by the other party. Now, how does he now deal with the fact that you've prevented him from trying to seal his destiny by having this magnificent fight and dying heroically? And that's where narrative comes in. So now you've got an interesting kind of conflict to resolve as a party and in a narrative as well. This is where story comes from. It comes from this kind of conflict. But if it's artificial conflict, it doesn't work. But if it genuinely comes out of the characters, then that's cool as well. I played another character where there was a psychic. One of the other characters was a very strange and sort of thiefy type of character. But we'd set it up that this thief had been given a side mission to look after my father, who was very wealthy. But I hadn't been told as a character, but this thief character had been told that it was a big bag of gold at the end of the adventure if he keeps me alive. So he's got this meta. He's desperately trying to keep this stupid paladin character alive, and I know it as a player because obviously you can have those moments outside the story, but within the story, we were on a boat, and I'm in plate armor, and I wanted to jump into the river to fight the monster, and the DM said, "Well, you can't swim in the armor." And I went, "No, I know I can't, but my character is ignoring that." And so I jumped in, and everyone's going, "What are you doing?" And I'm doing what my character does, which is, and now I'm going to start drowning. So somebody better come in and try and get me. You got to get me out of this situation. And it became a really interesting moment in the adventure because they were all really angry with me because I had to keep me alive. And I had a few people going, "Yeah, but that was really annoying." I said, "It wasn't annoying. It was wonderful. It was wonderful storytelling because we created this scene of this lunatic paladin who jumped in the water and was starting to drown. The thief had gone in after him because he's worth a lot of money at the end of this adventure. And you got the magic user and the druid going, 'This is insane. We've got the monster to fight as well.' And the DM went with it, and it was great. We survived, and I was dragged out of the water, and I was pumped water was pumped out of my lungs, and I was revived. But it was a really memorable moment of role playing. And I think when you're constructing a novel, it's the same. You almost need to do things with your characters that you definitely wouldn't do, but your character would. Your protagonist would because of their motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I probably talked too long and passionately about
No,
that.
I love it. I love it. Do you play today? Do you still play tabletop role-playing games?
I try, but I very rarely find the time. I've got a young family and my horses, and I've got my business, and I've got the YouTube channel, and I've got my writing to do. So anybody who's a parent knows it's hard to find time. But I do find the time very occasionally. I was also trying to find people who I enjoy adventuring with, and my ideal role-playing team is a bunch of people that are having fun, and the idea isn't to kill all the monsters and get the gold. The idea is to have a brilliant adventure and all sit back at the end of the evening and go, "That was mad but brilliant."
I love that. That's the goal. That's the dream right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you mentioned writing, so let's kind of branch off into that for 5 seconds here. Your book, Blood of Blackthorn, how much historical research, relevance, accuracy is there? How much is leaning more into the fantasy side? Kind of walk me through the balance there.
Well, it's an interesting setup because it takes place in what we would think of the 14th, 15th century. So the late 14th, early 15th. So plate armor is a thing, but it isn't our world exactly. But the characters in it don't know it's not our world because it's their world. So the king is not named, for example. The king is just the king. And because everybody knows who the king is, it's the king, isn't he? And the place is called the realm or the kingdom. And there are places outside, there's the northern tribes and there's the western tribes, the sea people as well, that are being shot off. And our character, the protagonist, is a fairly lowly knight, and he gets involved. The book opens with the siege of a rebel baron, and our hero succeeds in being the first man over the wall. And the king has said he'll earn the castle. Anyway, it turns out the king wasn't quite being true, so he does earn a castle, but he doesn't earn the castle, this big fancy castle. He gets sent to the borderlands to a fiefdom, still significant, but a fiefdom that's not had a lord for a long time, and he gets sent out of the kingdom to a place he's not comfortable with, and he's not well known, and he doesn't have much in the way of money, and he's got to rebuild on the borderlands, and he's got to forge new alliances. And it is heavily based on the medieval period, but in this world, magic does exist, but in a very background type of way. So there are two competing religions. There's the religion of the book, if you like, which is the sort of more of medieval Christian, a kind of a similar thing to Christianity, with bishops and church people and monks and things. So it's very heavily real. But then there's the old ways as well, which aren't talked about very much, and in fact still exist, but nobody talks about it because it's impolite to do so in high society, because it's the old stuff. The peasants and the ordinary people know it exists. So they know, but don't have any direct experience of goblins in the woodlands. And unicorns have definitely been seen, but not by me, but by somebody whose friend I know has definitely seen a goblin. People have got tales of dragons, and our hero, learns about one of these dragon tales from his grandfather, who tells it as if it's a myth. But his grandfather, according to his grandfather, did fight a dragon. But he, of course, thinks it's all nonsense, it's all fanciful. And as the story goes on, we learn as the reader that maybe some of it is true, maybe some of it isn't, and maybe some of it is true. But it's still very realistic, it's still very grounded. So we don't have people casting magic spells, but it happens in the background. There's weird stuff. There's a weird set of woodlands, of big forest with a path through it that our hero has to take. And the woods seem to be encroaching as he rides through it. The woods are encroaching on him, and then he manages to get outside, and they sort of back away again. And is it his imagination, or is it something happening? So that was the idea, to try and imagine what a world would be like if these things almost certainly might exist. And nobody's quite sure. But some people are sure, and some people are sure that they don't exist, and some people are sure they do exist. And lots of people exist in this sort of limbo state in the middle, which is kind of yes, kind of no, but doesn't really affect me very much. I've got to get the harvest in anyway, and I've got to look after the horses, and I've got to look after the pigs. So all of that stuff, who knows?
That sounds like a historically accurate experience, though. Like I'm sure back then they thought it was real. Like they knew somebody who had seen a unicorn or had heard a goblin outside the door at night one night, or they didn't leave milk out for the fairies, so their cat disappeared. Like they believed that. So it sounds like you're tapping into that historical accuracy.
I am trying to. Things like, so for example, it occurred to me that in a way unicorns do exist in our world. They're called rhinoceros. So a single-horned creature, albeit not very frail and pale looking, but there is a creature with a single horn. It's called a rhinoceros, but it doesn't resemble the unicorns we know. But in the medieval mind, in medieval Europe, clearly people were telling the truth when they'd seen a single-horned beast that galloped like a horse, just happened to be quite stumpy. But also the narwhal. The narwhal exists, and people had real unicorn horns. So you've got this weird balance that and unicorns are mentioned in the Bible as well. So, which is true, obviously, as far as those people were concerned, and it was all literally true for those people. And therefore, you had real tales from Africa, from travelers of unicorns over there, and you had proof because you'd seen somebody's actual unicorn, but you've never seen one. So do unicorns exist in the same way? Well, yes, in the medieval mind, I think they probably did. And this idea that the further away from home you go, the more strange everything gets, is still prevalent today. Let's face it, lots of people don't travel very much. And when you travel, you realize that people are people. They live in cities or live in the countryside. They might speak a different language, but they all pretty much want to live a decent and peaceful life and get on with doing things that people want to do. They don't have a single foot that they shelter under to keep the sun from their face. They don't have dog heads or fish tails. But, I think that stuff is fascinating. And we still do it to a certain extent today.
So what happens when you take a book like that, where there is that authentic sensation and feeling and mindset of a historical setting, and then you inject real magic? What does that do to those narratives when suddenly there is real in your face spell casting or a magical object? Or
Well, it causes confusion. Is that people deal with unpalatable truths today. They get into denial, or they figure out a rationalization. They go, that can't be true. It's like, when it is, well, I don't believe it. Or it's fake news, or any of the, we're living through really fascinating times at the moment in geopolitics. And you can see the same kind of justifications. Some people go, I'm going to have to completely reevaluate my understanding of the world. And some people go, no, I don't want to reevaluate my understanding of the world. I'm just going to deny that happened, even though I've seen it. It didn't happen that way. I'm going to reimagine it and rethink it and put it in a different context and put it in a different, which is going to say it didn't happen. People back in the medieval period did the same. People in 400 years are going to be doing the same. Sadly, human beings do this because it's a way of coping. And I think if you're writing a story, you can do the same. There's one of the characters in the story that sort of has personally witnessed things that are very unusual and almost certainly magical. And when asked, he sort of goes, I haven't got time. I'm not bothered about it. Hasn't had much of impact on me. I'm not that bothered. So you can worry about it if you like, but I'm just going to pretend I didn't see it, or because he can't deal with it. He doesn't have the tools to deal with it, whereas other characters do, and other characters lean into the whole thing. But you've still got horses, you've still got lances, you've still got castles that need to be repaired. You've still got a moat that's got to be dug out because it is just a mess and it isn't really a good moat. You've still got trees in the wrong, you've got brush in the wrong places that got to be cleared out. You've got roads that have got to be improved. In this particular place, there's a bridge. There's a very significant strategic bridge that's got to be dealt with. And there are neighbors that have got to be communicated with. And that's where true narrative is in the kind of situations of conflict and how people in the story deal with those conflicts in a meaningful way. One person might deal with it by being very aggressive. The other person might want to talk, and everything in between. And there's probably a time for talking. Hopefully most of us will talk first. And then sometimes you have to get into the physical altercation, but hopefully you can wind that back. Misunderstandings happen as well. Misdirection. I always find misdirection or people assuming the worst about other people is fertile ground for novels, a story. Because we as the viewer and the reader, no, you see both sides. You go, no, don't think that, because this person's good as well. But the characters might not see it that way. They might interpret it in a much stronger, more aggressive way. And again, that's part of the story. So I've tried to bring that out. So magic, if magic exists, it depends on how all-encompassing the magic is. If it's magic like Dungeons and Dragons, where pretty much every other person has some kind of incredibly powerful magic spells, society would be very different because, you know, who would fix your plumbing? And if you can do magic spells, wouldn't you have magic spells to make your life easier? To heat water, yes, because you don't want to wash in cold water.
Right.
Does somebody go around heating up everybody's water? Is that their job? Yeah, are they water heater? They just walk around the village, quickly zapping everybody's jug of water for their morning ablutions,
Right.
heat it up, and you've got hot water. Everybody's got hot water. Great, and you pay the fire mage some money to heat your water. Not very adventurous or heroic, but probably how it would happen.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got minor magic spells to heal things, you've got an injured pig or an injured horse. Well, you're going to go to the magic user and pay them a penny. Can you cast a spell to fix my lame horse, please? Yeah, sure. Think, okay, fixed. These are the sort of ordinary level things, and I find that is really intriguing to look into. How would you use those magic spells for everyday circumstances?
Yeah.
You know, lighting a fire in the wilderness is a pain in the arse sometimes, especially if the wood's dry. Well, if you can control fire, brilliant. You don't have to worry about it, but get it going and then rest. That was probably what fire mages would be doing most, rather than casting fireballs at monsters. They'd probably be lighting campfires and because it's more convenient than using a flint and steel. If you can fly, what does that do to the transport infrastructure? If you've got a spell where you can run incredibly fast, well, you make a great messenger. So you could set up a whole postal system of mages that can haste between various places. Are they going to be doing that? Yeah, some people don't want to go into dangerous dungeons and risk their life. Some people are just happy to make decent coin by doing an ordinary job. And if you had a flying spell, and you could do it once a day, great. You make a great postman. There you go.
I love those kind of worlds where they extrapolate what society would be like if magic was extremely common. Like,
yeah,
it's fascinating.
Well, I always wonder about economy as well, because as we all know, I've studied the economics a little bit at a very basic level, that supply and demand is a thing. And in the medieval period, there were times when nobody was making money. Nobody's making actual coins anymore. And coins get lost and, they get used up or they get hoarded and buried. And sometimes there were times in English medieval history where there weren't coins to go around. So you suddenly had to drop to a barter system, or there weren't coins enough to do big things. So somebody had to invent new coins and make them work, and all of that around the coin clipping, and it's not pure gold, it's 50% gold, and then what's it actually worth, and all of that wonderful, complex economic arguments. But at the same time, if you have a village shop and there are adventurers coming in with magic weapon after magic weapon after magic weapon, who's going to buy those magic weapons if you buy them off the adventurers? People are going, okay, so it's +3 magic sword, but I've got 6 of them, dude. To be honest, nobody. This is a village. Who wants a magic sword? Well, other adventurers, yeah, but do you want to? I don't want to buy it. What? Not for? I know. I've my shelf is filled with magic swords. All right, and I'll take it off your hands for a penny. All right, just do you a convenience. But this is a magic sword. Yeah, I know, and I've got 6 of them, and they're not selling very well. Because everybody around here has got a magic sword from that bloody dungeon over there that seems to be endless, that everybody goes into. Some people come out of it laden down with jewels and gold. I've got more rubies than I can shake a stick at. The kids are using them as marbles in the street because nobody wants them. Because let's face it, if something becomes so common, there's no scarcity value. So suddenly the price collapses. Diamonds. In our modern society, diamonds are only valuable because there's a diamond cartel that artificially restricts the amount of diamonds released to the market. If they released all the diamonds all the time, diamonds would be dramatically cheaper.
Yeah.
They're allowed to kind of create an artificial system for that. Would you have the same system? Would you have guilds of adventurers going, you know what? I know you've got 6 magic swords, but we cannot release more than 1 magic sword to the public. We just have to have a massive warehouse filled with magic weapons of all sorts, and we will slowly release them to the community to keep this way. We literally have that in the modern day. Oil prices, hugely influential on modern economy. Price goes up and down because people decide to get more oil out of the ground, and then suddenly the price comes down. Everybody goes, oh no, all those people who are trying to get oil from shale, which is expensive, suddenly can't make it. They can't make any money anymore. So they close it down. And you can imagine a fantasy setting where I wouldn't bother, to be honest. You can't buy a turnip for a magic sword. There's too many of them. Um, the economy would collapse. There's only so much gold an economy can swallow before gold becomes like silver, and before silver becomes like copper, and copper is totally valueless.
Right.
So I find all of that fascinating. I mean, I'm not trying to take away from the heroic fantasy trope or whatever, but sometimes, especially in a computer game, you can model this, but it does frustrate the player because they've risked their life and they've got nothing of value.
It plays with expectations. It'd be a fun world building exercise, if nothing else, just to take it as far as you can and see what comes out of it. That's cool.
One of the other things that occasionally occurs to me is a magic animal. So if an animal can talk to you, I tell you what, I train horses, and one of the things about training horses is trying to communicate with a horse with body language, because you can't talk to a real horse verbally. You sort of can, but not. If you could explain to a horse, I want you, can you do this for me? Maybe they'd say, no, go away. I'm too tired. Or, yeah, okay, cool. That sounds good. Let's have a go at that. If the horse wants to have a go at jousting, maybe some horses that are talking horses would go, no, I don't like that. It's a bit dangerous for me. So can I just start around pulling a cart, please? No, but you're a mighty warhorse. Yeah, but I don't really want to do that. I just don't fancy it. I'm having a bad day. I've got a headache. I'm having a bad day. I don't want to joust. And then the other thing I stumbled across was inns, right? So inns exist. They're basically travel lodges, motels, whatever, in the medieval period. You go there, you pay a bit of money, and you stable your horse or your pack ponies or whatever it is, stay overnight, drink and eat, and then on your way again. In an adventurous setting, a tavern would be attached and that kind of stuff. If you're traveling on different creatures, which probably could be in a high fantasy, you're going to have to keep them in the inn as well. But some of them aren't compatible. Horses and horses will mix, horses and ponies and donkeys and camels and things. Fine, they're all herbivores. But if you're riding, I don't know, a war cat the size of a huge tiger, that's not going to mix with the horses. You need special facilities. You're going to have to pay more money to the animal handlers. And there's going to be this whole group of society that are going, I tell you what, we can deal with hippogriffs, but we can't deal with battle cats. All right, battle cats, you'd have to go couple of inns down. They specialize in battle cats and war dogs. Okay, giant war dogs and dragons. Right, they've got a fireproof place. Okay, but it's going to cost you a fortune. And so you suddenly think, you know what? That's really fun. You could have a whole role-playing session around an inn with incompatible creatures that all turn up at the same time, and they all want to bed for the night. And they're just, and the innkeeper's doing his nut trying to work out how to make it all work. And I just think, yeah, that would work really well. That's such fun.
That would make a great story even. That's fantastic. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And my last idea is about gong farmers. So have you heard of the term gong farmer?
Gold?
Gong, G-O-N-G, gong farmer. So gong farmer was a real profession in the medieval period. Their job was to empty cesspits of human waste. Very important. People poop into pits and it gets dug out by human beings, put into wheelbarrows and sold to farmers, or sold to people who are using it for tannery, or sold to make gunpowder in the later medieval period of saltpeter. These people became very, very wealthy because they're dealing with other people's poop. Okay? That still exists in a medieval fantasy setting. You're going to have a category of worker, of sort of municipal worker, that are gong farmers, that are the poop trucks. And in a lot of medieval societies, they did this stuff after dark. They didn't do it during the day because obviously people don't want to look at wagon loads of poop.
Right.
In the when they're polite, they want to have this done undercover and out of the way. And so you've got a whole tranche of societies, not just the thieves and the thieves guild and the assassins going around at night. You've also got the poop trucks trundling around. And it suddenly occurred to me, the Gong Farmers Guild is going to be powerful. It's going to know stuff because it is going out at night totally legitimately, is going to have a relationship with the Thieves Guild because thieves and the Gong Farmers, in cesspits, sometimes things drop down there and they, the Gong Farmers, the cesspit emptiers will need to shift a jewel that they found in the cesspit of the local castle. That jewel could be really important, a magic ring that's fallen off the finger and fallen into the poop and taken it. And they're going to know the assassins as well. There's going to be some kind of deal done with the Poop Guild and the Assassins Guild, because the assassins know they've got cesspits that need to be emptied as well. And the Thieves Guild does as well. The Thieves Guild has garderobes and toilets that need emptying. So the Gong Farmers are going to be very well connected with all strata of society. And it suddenly occurred to me, there's fertile, if you pardon the expression, fertile ground for storytelling in an urban environment, in a fantasy city. Somebody is emptying the cesspits and they know a lot about a lot of people. Now that is a brilliant setting for a story. Really interesting, and you don't think about it. So anyway, there you go.
Wow, that's a hell of a brain you've got there. That's incredible. The fact that they go out at night in a fantasy setting would also mean that they predominantly be nocturnal, like drow or orc, or so you're going to have that.
Yeah. Can vampire? Not all vampires are going to be wealthy.
Yeah.
Is a job that the only job a vampire can do, if you follow the rules of they can't, killed by sunlight or whatever, is at night. Well, that's it needs strength as well, persistence. You need to be comfortable at night with night vision. You need to be good at digging poop. You go on, and you suddenly go, you know what? You could have goblins and vampires working together in a night soil, because they're called night soil men, and a night soil team. You've got yourself a little team of municipal workers that are the underclass. And that's cool. That is really cool, but they're well connected. Nobody's the Thieves Guild is going to steer clear of the poop collectors because they need their latrines emptying too. And you suddenly think, wow, that's really intriguing. You're right. Vampires. Would you need a strong, stupid character? Do you need a troll with a shovel?
Yeah.
Who's really dumb but is looked after and doesn't really want to fight anybody? And he helps shovel. He's the one that jumps down into it and shovels it all out. And he's big and smelly, but he doesn't mind because he's a troll.
It's right at home.
Yeah.
There's so many opportunities there. You've got to do something with that. That's brilliant.
Well, I've got so many ideas I might do, but I'm happy to fling the ideas out because as a principle thing, these are, if you study history, you discover things like this. You discover simple things like tanneries were always downwind and downstream. So if you go to a new city in the medieval period, you will be able to find where the tanneries are because it's downstream and downwind because they stink. And, polite society wants the tanneries to not cast their stench across their houses. So you suddenly got a sort of geography. So the posh houses are going to be upwind. And upstream, and the poor houses and the industrial places that are going to produce effluent are going to be downstream. So suddenly the geography makes sense. So things like that. It comes from history. It just comes from reading. And I would encourage people, if you want ideas for adventures, look up history. Look up history of ordinary people and ordinary jobs, and imagine what it was like. What it'd be like if you turn it into a kind of a prosaic and ordinary fantasy setting, because fantasy can be fantastical, but you've also, I was watching Lord of the Rings recently, the extended edition, and I was looking at Lorien, and I was thinking, lovely, brilliant, majestic, and everything, but somebody's cooking the food. Somebody's sweeping. Somebody's sweeping as well. There are elves, presumably they're elves, I don't know, whose job is to work as chefs,
Mhm.
to prepare wonderful meals for their guests. There's going to be delivery services. There are going to be high elves that deliver food as well. And you suddenly think this isn't mentioned in Lord of the Rings, but it has to exist in their infrastructure to make Lothlorien beautiful place that it is, to make it work. And you suddenly think, you know what? There's a whole category of existence in wonderful places like that I've not really thought about. And I wonder, I wonder how it works and what it does. And then you start speculating and you can just go everywhere with it, and I just find that I love it. I love exploring that idea.
I, the whole point of talking to you today was to figure out how can we use history and the research of history to inform narratives in games and fiction today. And that's the answer right there. Is doing that research allows you to look at things in a different way and examine the minutia and try and understand how things would work that people may not look at, not just the glossy surface stuff, but what's happening underneath. What's the night soil team doing? Who's cooking the food? There's stories there.
And it gives you stories, and it gives your stories depth as well, because, if your barbarian gang is sitting in a tavern drinking, well, suddenly you've got your tavern maids, and you've got your barkeeper and innkeeper or whatever talking to them. If somebody's cooking, sure, but what else is going on? Is somebody delivering cabbages out the back? Somebody's going to be taking away the empties. Somebody smashes a flagon, and somebody's got to go to the potter to get a new one. And you suddenly start seeing this deep dimension of real lives, even in a fantasy setting, which is rich possibility of stories.
Beautiful. That's what I was looking for today. That kind of ties it in a nice little bow. That's what I wanted.
My pleasure. For the way my mind works, it's always worked this way, and and I'm happy to share. And I get excited with new ideas, and I don't have the time to build on all these new ideas at all. So other people can have a go. Go for it.
I may steal a couple myself. Okay, so before we start heading for the door, there's a couple questions I like to ask everybody. One of them is kind of the philosophical question that lives at the core of this little podcast experiment of mine. So I'm going to hit you with it, and this will be fun. In my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but also things like improv, comic book writing, film, all of these things where people can just get together, hang out. There's a natural fellowship, a shared language. What is the common thread that holds that space together?
An ability to step outside yourself and the space that is familiar to you. It's something that I've always wanted to do. Is why I want to train horses, because I want to know what it's like to train horses. Some horses you can train easily. Some horses do certain things more easily. And then I will use my imagination to imagine what it's like to train a battle cat or a giant riding war dog or whatever it might be, or a dragon. So how can you train a dragon? Okay, well, probably the same way you train a real horse, with different commands. Depends how intelligent the dragon is, and depends what you want it to do. Can you teach a dragon to roll over? I can teach a horse to roll over. It takes a long time, but I can teach them to do it. Can you teach a dragon to show off in the ring, doing all the fancy pants moves? And I think the answer is probably yes. And if the answer is yes, somebody's done it. Somebody's tried it. So that's cool. And so, yeah, I think the ability to go, right, what do I do that's mundane? And how I brush my teeth. How did medieval people brush their teeth? Well, actually, they did have toothbrushes sometimes, but also they were expensive. They used twigs. And you suddenly think, yeah, they use twigs. And then people go, yeah, and we use twigs in the subcontinent of India all the time. And that's what they say. They sell twigs instead of toothbrushes. And their culture, toothbrushes, chewing toothbrushes, and then not toothbrushes, chewing twigs and using it to clean the teeth is a thing they do. And you suddenly learn something about the real world, as well as thinking, well, okay, we don't do that in the West in the same way, but they do in some parts of the world. And they did in the medieval period in the West as well. So brilliant. I've just learned about other people, and I've learned about the past, and that's great. So yeah, I think an ability to think outside yourself.
That's a great answer. And I haven't heard that one before. So thank you for that. That's good.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, we're getting close to the end here. A couple quick fire questions just to get to know you a little better. What are you reading these days?
What am I reading? The last book I read, I delved into the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant again because I hadn't read those for a long time. I read them as a young man, so many decades ago, and I felt I wanted to reacquaint myself with that sort of Gothic world building, grand scheme of things, Lord Fowl and the Ill Earth War, and Lord Fowl's Bane. I also refamiliarized myself with Lord of the Rings about a year ago because I loved the movies. Lots of things wrong with the movies. They're not perfect, but they are brilliant. I really love them. But I also felt I had lost a little bit of connection with the actual book. So I went back to the book to read it. And as usual with a good book, whatever the book might be, you see different things again because you're at a different period in your life. So you see it differently. And I'm reading quite a lot of, which is the book I've got at the moment next to me? I'm reading quite a lot of books about medieval women at the moment because I'm really interested in a fairly unrepresentative part of history, which is what medieval women wrote about and how and why. And it's something I'm interested in exploring because it's way outside my comfort zone. And obviously, I'm not a woman. And therefore, I think it's really interesting to learn a little bit about historical perspectives if I can. And there's some really interesting stuff about it, but there's also not much, which makes it even more challenging. And then court roles, they're very dry and some of them are incredibly boring, but you flick through them and you think again, oh, that's interesting. Tragedy, like people falling down wells when drunk and dying is just awful human tragedy, but it brings it back that happened to people back then, happens to people now, but it happened to people back then. It was written down about, and there were some weird rules as well. You start to read about this. There's a rule that you, under the Danes and under the Normans in England, if you found a dead body, if you could prove it was Norman, there was a bigger fine. There was a fine for the whole area. There was a murderum fine. And it was quite a lot of money. So the whole area, monasteries were exempt from this, but the whole area will be fined unless you could find the person who did the murder. If the body wasn't Norman, but was an Englishman, the murder and fine didn't count. So there are stories, and it's kind of funny but grim as well. But there are stories of people desperately trying to prove this corpse is an Englishman, not a Norman, because if they can prove it's an Englishman, they don't get fined. And if it turns out to be a Norman, they do get fined. And the fine is, it's the equivalent of, thousands of pounds for each person. So it's well worth trying to pretend this person is an Englishman. It's called a writ. It's called Englishry. It's proving Englishry, and it's designed to save you money. It's all very, it's just odd. But it mattered. It mattered to people. So I'm reading court roles because you
find
stimulation for the brain about unusual crimes as well.
Yeah. It gives you a viewpoint of history, but it also kind of gives you a peek into the human condition in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. The one recently I did a thing on medieval fashion crime. So, for example, there's times when the law says your shoes are not allowed to be pointed more than 2 inches from the end of your feet. The implication being people are going around with ridiculously pointy shoes.
Right.
Which they were. And so they brought in a law, and you could be fined money for having shoes that were too pointy by the authorities, unless you were noble. So if you were noble, you could have pointy shoes. And guess what? People wanted to show off, so they had pointy shoes and they got fined. And then they had to prove they were noble and they didn't get fined. And then there are complaints about men's jackets being indecently short in the medieval period. So the young bravos of the medieval town were going around with indecently short jackets and showing off their bits. And you think, oh my goodness, that's outrageous, even today. But it suddenly you go, yeah, so you wouldn't write this down and have a law unless it was a proper menace. So you've got these young men strutting around like young men do. They still do today. They're showing off and everything, showing off with absurd fashions. And you think, yeah, so it's not just now, is it? It's back then as well. It's the same. It's the same thing happening. So yeah, so I just love it. So
That's fascinating. Imagine the fine David Bowie would have got for Labyrinth, showing off the package.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. But is it a crime? No, it's different. The crime. I guess indecent exposure still exists, but yeah, it's very much about how short your doublet was. And then you'll have the police. You'll have police going around saying, your jacket's too short, sir. We're going to have to fine you. Here's a fine. Imagine if we had that today. Maybe we do. Some places they do have religious police, don't they? Telling people what they can and can't wear.
That's
So
true.
it still exists, you know.
Yeah. Humans will be humans.
Mm.
All right. Well, we're getting close to the end here. I do like to open up a little space here near the end for you to just promote mention things that are out there that you want people to look at or where to find you online. Obviously, a book coming out. Just get me a little more time.
I've got a Kickstarter for a book for special editions of my book called Lord of Blackthorn. It's the first of a trilogy. I've written the first one. It's ready to go. It'll be published to the general public sometime next year. I've committed to writing a trilogy, and I haven't written the next two books. So I'm excited and also slightly nervous about more writing. You know what it's like if you're a writer. It's like, oh, what have I done? I'm going to have to keep writing now, right? But there's a lot more to explore in the book. It's called Lord of Blackthorn. If people want to hear me on YouTube, Modern History TV, there's tons of work there. I'm amazed to think that I've got over 860,000 subscribers now. So it's doing hugely well. And I'm very flattered that people like my work there. You can see me on a horse using swords and also walking through the woods talking about fashion, poor people traveling and that kind of stuff. And then if people want to see another part of me, all the Rebellion games, so Sniper Elite, Zombie Army, very different from my hobbies of medievalness and writing, but yeah, CEO of a I suppose it's multinational. I don't know where, a big company, CEO of a big company with all the stresses and strains that brings. But I'm only CEO because somebody's got to be, and I use it as a vehicle to do cool things.
Nice. We never talked about it or even touched on it, but I do want to throw it in here really quickly as well. You also wrote Leading the Rebellion, a book about leadership based upon the chivalric code and applying those tenets to leadership and mentorship.
Yeah. But I thought it was a fun idea to try and I'm a huge believer in ethics in business, and I think the world needs a little bit more ethical structure. I mean, too many people, the media loves unethical business. You know, the bad CEO is a bit of a trope. The bad business is a trope, but it exists. You know, people are bad in business sometimes, but there are also a lot of people that run businesses very ethically. And so I was having conversations with my friends and family and talking about the chivalric code and how it's a useful guideline for men who are good at fighting to know how to behave, to help them understand how to behave, to sort of control the worst parts, some of the worst parts of an ability to fight. You know, the fighting is necessary and good sometimes, but it could also be unnecessary and bad. So how do we formulate a plan to get the best out of being able to fight and control the worst? And so the rules of chivalry, I thought it was an interesting structure to write a sort of business book and it's called Leading the Rebellion, questing to succeed in life and business. And it talks about how I've tried to use elements of the rules of chivalry to reflect my business. So it can be as simple as tell the truth if you can, pay your bills on time, try and be decent to people as a default. I'm a great believer in repeat business. You know, if somebody buys my book or my game, I really want them to buy the next one. I want them to have a great experience, to feel they've got value for money, enjoy it, and then go, what else has he done? Oh, he's done this. Oh, okay, that's cool. I'll buy that now. And so I'm a huge believer in that. I'm not a believer in this sort of rapacious business philosophy of screw the other guy over and move on, because I think you actually lose more than you gain without even realizing it, because you do a disservice to somebody, they will mention to other people. You might not even know it, but they'll go, oh, I wouldn't work with them. Or if you have to work with them, okay, I understand, but get your money up front. or just charge a bit extra from me because they did me a disservice. And you won't even know that they're doing that. And you'll lose out. And there are big figures on the world stage that have done that to people. And I think they probably could have been an awful lot more successful if they'd been, and if they'd been ethical in business. That doesn't mean being a pushover. It doesn't mean doing bad deals or anything like that, or not fighting to win, but it means working out when you do it and how you do it. So it was a bit of a personal exercise, and it was very successful. A lot of people have found it quite valuable. And one of the key things about that is, for me, was the framing things in the quest, because I love the quest narrative. And I've said you don't have to be searching for the Holy Grail. There are lots of other quests. A quest can be to find a good job, can be to write that book at last. It can be to get up in the morning, because you're not feeling good about life and you're depressed and, everything seems shit. And it does to all of us sometimes. But if you frame it from this is the beast I've got to conquer today, it almost makes it more of an adventure. You think, right, okay, I'm gonna try and beat that beast. I'm gonna get up. I'm gonna exercise a bit more. I'm gonna eat a bit better. I'm just gonna do a little bit, and it can make even a commute in the mornings actually quite fun if you put a framework of a nightly quest over the top of it. It's just a little mind game, really, to help people sometimes deal with things that are just ordinary. If you frame it differently, you can get a different perspective on it.
I love that. That's brilliant.
We could do a whole other podcast on that.
And I'm going to bug you again in the new year, I promise you.
Great.
The links to all this will be in the show notes, so people can check out all this stuff and follow along. So that's about it. But before I push you out in the door, out into the cold, as you head out the door, I'm going to give you the last word. Do you have any parting words of wisdom?
Yeah, just be nice to people if you can possibly be.
Thank you for a wonderful evening, everyone. But it looks like it's once again time to close up shop. I just received word that the ghost of a long-forgotten bard has been wandering the halls, searching for his lost loot. His haunting melodies have begun to drift through the floorboards, and I'm not sure if they're meant to inspire or drive us mad, so it's probably best to play it safe and get out of here. But before we go, I want to once again say thank you to Jason for taking the time to stop by and share your stories. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, exploring, and sharing those worlds and stories. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.